Hi everyone, sorry it was a bit loud to start with. My name's Madeleine King. I'm your federal member for Brand. We're not scheduled to start for a couple of minutes, but we'll just get going because there's a lot to talk about in this lecture today. So I'd like to, and I will welcome the people that are online as well and welcome them tonight here, but also I'd like to especially acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Noongar people of the Whadjuk Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to thank Murdoch University for hosting us here tonight and the staff of Murdoch who come along and make sure this can stream to other people who can't be here and that it's recorded if you want to look at it at another time. So tonight we've got some very special guests here tonight, people experts in the field on the US election and foreign relations, Professor the Honourable Stephen Smith and Professor Gordon Flake. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about both of them and then I'm going to hand over to Gordon to speak for a bit and then to Stephen to speak for a bit, and then we'll try and keep that quite short so we can hear from the audience and see what questions you have, because the presidential election in the US was a momentous event, always is, but this time it was particularly interesting and we know other people have a lot of views and probably have a lot of questions. So to turn to Stephen, Stephen Smith was an elected member for Perth for 20 years, served in the Australian Parliament for that long. Before that, he was Principal Private Secretary of the Attorney-General of Western Australia, Joe Berenson, and also advisor to Paul Keating as Treasurer and then as Prime Minister. Once he was elected, he was in opposition for the Labor Party and served in a number of portfolios. We have in common that he has been Shadow Minister for Trade, and that is my current portfolio in the Labor opposition in the Federal Parliament. In government, the Labor Party went into government in 2007 and Stephen was made Minister for Foreign Affairs and then I believe later Minister for Trade as well. And then his last portfolio was Minister for Defence, which, as anyone that's from Rockingham and surrounding areas knows how important the Ministry for Defence is for our district, given that we host the largest and most important, of course, naval base in the whole country over at HMAS Stirling on Garden Island. Stephen left the Parliament at the 2013 election, went on to become a Professor of International Law at the University of Western Australia. We also share a love of field hockey, and he was a board member of Hockey Australia for some time. And then he was also, or now, is Director of the Perth USAsia Centre, which is an organisation I had a bit to do with before I got elected. It was my last job before I got elected, which was a great honour for me. I also just want to mention that Stephen's responsible for bringing some of the most powerful women in the world to Perth. In 2008, Condoleezza Rice was the US Secretary of State and Stephen invited her to Perth and she came and went to a number of events, but particularly Mercedes College in Perth, which I think your daughter was a student at the time. A remarkable event for Perth. Happy coincidence. And then in 2012, Stephen hosted the next US Secretary of State, or the next female Secretary of State, which is Hillary Clinton, where Hillary did a number of things, but it principally went to UWA to announce the funding for what became the Perth USAsia Centre. So Stephen's been great in bringing strong leaders from around the world to our home of Perth, which, as we know, is one of the major pivot points of the Indo-Pacific. So on to Gordon. Now, I first met Gordon Flake, Professor Gordon Flake from UWA at the Perth USAsia Centre, and I think 2013 was his first visit to Perth, and I was trying with some other people to recruit him to come and live in Perth to help me start the Perth USAsia Centre and to be its leader. And as Gordon will tell anyone, Perth is the most furthest part on the globe away from Washington DC, which is where he was living at the time. We were able to make him drink the Kool-Aid, and he did leave Washington DC and the Mansfield Foundation, which is a foundation that promoted understanding of Asian nations and peoples in the US. And also as an expert in North Korea, he added a lot to the intellectual thinking on Asia in America and DC, and now we're very lucky to have him in Perth to be able to help us understand our neighbours to the north. As many of you know, he was a regular commentator on the recent US election. We heard him on the ABC quite a bit. I would text him quite regularly saying, great show. He is now an Australian as well. Really has drunk the Kool-Aid, and he's also a Fremantle Dockers fan. So, hello. And it's my great pleasure to have worked with Gordon for about 3 years at the Perth USAsia Centre as we set that up and running, and he's turned it into the dynamic institution that it is today. So with that, I will hand over to Gordon to speak to us a bit about the election itself, and I think Stephen will then reflect on the implications, and then we'll talk to the wider audience. So how does that sound?
Sounds wonderful.
Okay, and you've got a lapel mic.
I do. So. Well, thank you so much, Madeleine. It's a great honour to be here. Madeleine was far more influential than you might know in convincing me to make that transition. It may surprise you to know that moving from Washington, D.C. to Perth is not part of a normal career trajectory in foreign affairs. But this is such a beautiful community. And 7 years in, having been naturalized as an Australian citizen, this year more than any other, I can't think of a better time to be an Australian, a better time to be in WA, a better time to be living in Perth. This has been a rough year for everybody, but we should all count ourselves particularly fortunate in this world, and so we're honored to be here. But if you disagree with anything I say this evening, then you can blame Madeleine, because she's the one who brought me here. Right? And she's like, as it works out. Let me also give a little bit more context for my transition here by way of introducing the topic. Well, I'm going to focus initially just on the state of the race, what's happened at the U.S. presidential election, and then Professor Smith will talk a little bit more specifically about implications for Australia, and then we'll keep our opening remarks as short as we can, just so we can have more of a conversation, because this topic is so wide, it is so consumed all of 2020 and candidly much of the last 6 years, and so I think there's more than enough to talk about, and we'll keep our initial remarks as short as we can. About 8 years ago, close to 9 years ago, I was approached by an executive search firm, an international headhunter, and they asked me to apply for the position as head of the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, our sister institution. And I looked at that carefully, I flirted with the idea, but in the end, my expertise, my experience, my passion were all in Asia. I was an Asia guy. And the idea of spending my days explaining the dysfunctionality of American politics to Australians was not what I wanted to do. You know, so I turned down that job, but you should always be nice to headhunters, because they came back to me 2 years later, working with Madeleine, and said, we've got the perfect job for you. It's Asia-focused. It's the Perth USAsia Centre. It's in Perth. And little did I know then that thanks to Donald Trump, I would spend the last 4 years explaining the dysfunctionality of American politics to Australians. So here we are. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack. I think there has been a strong element of watching a car crash in the U.S., right? I mean, it is so fascinating. It is a reality TV president presenting reality TV every single day. We watch his tweets, we hear the outlandish statements, we see the shocking developments, and it is captivating. It's captivating for not just U.S. audiences, for Australian audiences around the globe who have paid attention to this. And it's not necessarily been good. It's been a rough year, depending on where, again, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. If you're someone who identifies as a conservative and you believe in small government and budget discipline and free trade and alliances and international cooperation, it's not been a good 4 years for you either. It's been a really tumultuous 4 years. But I'm going to take a bit of a different tact and suggest that what we've seen in the last 3 months is actually really positive. There's been a lot of narrative out there about the demise of democracies globally, about some trouble with democracies as a form of government. But what we saw in the United States presidential election was remarkable. We saw 67% turnout. The highest rate of turnout in a U.S. presidential election in over 100 years. The last time was 1908 that you had that level of turnout. And those were the days when ward bosses would kind of drag people out and force them to vote. It's a very different era, right? So unlike Australia, the United States does not have mandatory attendance at the polls. We don't have mandatory voting in the United States. And so it's just optional. And so much of the race is really about how do you motivate people to come out and vote. And candidly, one of the primary strategies of one particular party has been to make it as difficult as possible to vote. The last 2 times my wife and I voted in the United States, we were living in a county outside of Washington, D.C., majority African-American county, and as a result, there's a deep incentive by the political powers to make it really difficult to vote in that county. We waited in line about 4.5 hours in the cold November night to vote each time, and there was no democracy sausage at the end of that line, right? Yeah, it was difficult, it was hard, and we had it relatively easy. This time around, you may have seen reports in the state of Texas that the government, in an effort to suppress voter turnout in minority districts, made sure that there was only one early voting drop-off box in each county. And that applied in Lubbock County with a population of 1,000, and that applied in Harris County in suburban Houston with a population of 1.7 million, right? One box for each, right? You saw in Georgia people waiting in line 9, 10, 11 hours to vote, right? So despite that, despite the difficulties, there was a historic turnout that led to over 81 million votes for Joe Biden, the most any presidential candidate has received in history. And now, of note, Donald Trump also got 74, getting close to 75 million votes, the most any Republican candidate has gotten in history. But Joe Biden got more than 7 million, almost 8 million more votes than Donald Trump did. That's a remarkable development. Now today is a very auspicious time. I'm sure Madeleine kind of picked the date just for that. So today was the day when the Electoral College formally cast their ballots. And again, this is one of these strange constitutional peculiarities of the United States system. So the election night itself, there was a lot of questions about what had happened, right? I have to take a step back here and give you a little bit of context. 2 years ago, in 2018, the United States had midterm elections. So these are elections just for Congress and the Senate where the U.S. president is not on the ballot. And traditionally, turnout in midterm elections without a president to drive people to the polls is really, really low. After 2 years of Trump, I had anticipated, and many observers anticipated, there would be something they called the blue wave. And this comes from the American predilection for calling Republican states red states and Democratic states blue states, right? That's the exact opposite of our preferred political colors here in Australia. But the night of the midterm elections in 2018, I went to bed shattered because the blue wave had not manifested itself. It didn't show up. There were marquee races in Florida, in Georgia, and Texas that everybody thought would turn blue in response to the first 2 years of the Trump administration. It didn't happen. And so I went to bed quite depressed, but over the next week, every day after every day after every day, as the votes began counting and coming in, and absentee ballots and mail-in ballots were counted and coming in, right, it became apparent that there really was a blue wave, right? It was the largest two-party swing in the last 100 years of American politics in 2018. And the reason I mention that now is because if you were, like many, on election morning here in Australia watching the U.S. election results this time during the presidential election in 2020, you may have said, what happened? How in the world? It looks like Donald Trump is winning again. And so as Madeleine mentioned, I spent most of the entire day on TV and radio, and I had this Zen-like calm about me because of the learned experience of 2018. I just kept saying, wait, watch, wait and watch. And the reason of this goes back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier. In the United States, if you are able to wait for a long time in the polls to vote on election day, and again, it's not a holiday, it's during a Tuesday, you don't get work off for it, right? You do it, it's really hard. So Americans who vote on election day tend to be older, wealthier, and whiter than the population writ large, right? They can afford to wait in line, take time, right? And so the ballots that are cast and counted on election day are going to skew overwhelmingly Republican. So if you're just watching those results in the day, you're like, oh, this is a shocker. It looks like Trump has won. And Trump himself and many of his supporters thought that as well. And yet, if you had any understanding of what was happening in the middle of COVID, you have this tremendous shift to mail-in ballots, right? which is a remarkable thing to do for the first time for many states. Also, those who did early balloting, turning in, those votes are not being tabulated till later. So on election night, you saw one thing. Over the course of the next week, it became quite clear that something quite dramatic had happened. And that is that a sitting United States president, an incumbent president, for only the fourth time in 100 years, was deposed. There are tremendous powers in the American system that if you are the incumbent, you're the sitting president, you almost always will be given a second term. In this case, Donald Trump was not. But it was very difficult for the president himself, with a rather fragile psyche, to accept those results. And on an unprecedented level, he encouraged his supporters and a Republican Party, which he owns lock, stock, and barrel at this point, to reject those results. But despite that, the system has worked. Despite that, last Tuesday, every state certified their electorals, and today, every state voted. And so the Electoral College margin was 306 to 223, the exact same margin that it was 4 years ago. But again, to tell you how strange the U.S. system was, that's despite the fact that Donald Trump lost by nearly 3 million votes, and Joe Biden won by nearly 8, and yet they had the exact same number of Electoral College votes, right, in terms of how that system works. But the net result is that Joe Biden is the president-elect. He will be inaugurated on the 20th of January, right? Now, the last thing I'll say here, because I've already gone on a little bit too long, is that I was doing a media interview last week on ABC Radio, and they pulled up a short audio clip of the current U.S. ambassador to Australia, A.B. Culverhouse, who had visited Perth last week, and he gave a speech where he said, look, for all the concern and worries, the guardrails of American constitutional democracy remain in place, right? That, the Electoral College will vote as we anticipate. The inauguration will take place as we anticipate. There will be a change of government. The guardrails are in place. And I couldn't help but be a little bit cheeky in saying, I fully agree with Ambassador Culverhouse. The guardrails are in place, but it's generally not a good practice to take your car and slam it up against the guardrail and drag along it for a couple of months, right? Because it damages the guardrails, and it damages your car, and it damages your reputation, and your insurance probably won't like it either, right? But in general, I agree with them, that this has been a difficult process, and one which I end up being quite optimistic about the future. So I'll get back into that a little bit, but I've already gone far too long. This election obviously has real implications for Australia, has implications for the world at large, and who better than a former defense minister, former foreign minister, to help kind of put that in context. So, Stephen, sorry I went on for long there.
Well, thanks very much, Gordon. And Madeleine, thanks for that kind introduction. When I retired from the Parliament, I went back to the University of Western Australia, where I got my law degree before Madeleine was born. And then I spent a bit of time in the United Kingdom, where I did a master's degree in international law, so I returned to what was my sort of academic major or academic interest. So now I dabble in international law, but I'm also on the board of the Perth USAsia Centre, which Gordon is the CEO of. And in those two capacities, I have the chance to continue to follow and study those things which, if you've ever had the great privilege of being a minister, you have an enduring interest in that content for the rest of your life. So having had the privilege of being a foreign minister, a defence minister and a trade minister, Madeleine, like me, my first portfolio in opposition was trade minister, same with Madeleine, so I hope that Madeleine at some stage has the chance to be a trade minister, because she'd be very good at it. But it's a life-changing experience, but you do, after that sort of day-to-day activity for a number of years, you can see things by standing back and just seeing strategically how things move. You don't have any skin in the game, and you can just see how things evolve and unfold. So I think with Trump's election and then Biden's election formally effected but one step today, it's always worthwhile, I think, just looking at what was the opportunity cost of Clinton not winning. So we breathe a sigh of relief when Trump is defeated for a whole range of reasons. But when Clinton was Secretary of State, she very much pushed for what Obama called the pivot. the pivot to the Indo-Pacific. In other words, Obama, Clinton and other people, as we did in Australia, worked out that the whole world was changing, that the world would not stay static. So for a nanosecond after the collapse of the Soviet Union, America was the one great superpower. Then we saw the rise of China, and you could see that there were going to end up being, for a historical nanosecond, two superpowers, the US and China. And the US and China are now in strategic competition or strategic contest, depending upon how you view that relationship. But we also saw that in the blink of an eye, another great power would emerge. By the midpoint of this century, India would be a great power. So India, like China, a country of 1.4 million people, 1.4 billion people, a democracy, but also with a better age demographic than China. So by the time you get to 2050, India will be the second or third largest economy in the world on all of the current projections, China, US and India, or China, India, US. But also, in our part of the world, by the time we get to 2050, Indonesia is also on the rise. So a country of 300 million people, by the time we get to the midpoint of this century, Indonesia will be the fourth largest economy in the world. And so the analysis that we saw more than a decade ago, 15 years ago, was economic power and as a consequence strategic power, political power, military power, was being dragged from the North Pacific, US and China, southwards and westward to involve and incorporate the Indian Ocean through India and Indonesia. And that's why Australia started to talk about the Indo-Pacific and why the United States and other countries started talking about not the Asia-Pacific, but the Indo-Pacific, which is a pointer and a signal to the Indian Ocean, to the rise of India and the rise of Indonesia as a global influence. And it suits Australia, it suits Western Australia's convenience and Perth convenience and the naval base that we have further south of here, that we're Australia's Indian Ocean capital. So when we wake up, we look at the Indian Ocean, we think about our part of the world, unlike our colleagues on the eastern seaboard who naturally think about the Pacific and Northeast Asia. And so one of the areas of ongoing study for Gordon and for me has been what's happening in what we call the Indo-Pacific. And Clinton, as Secretary of State, was fully supportive of enhancing the US's engagement, not just with Australia, but with Indonesia, with India, with ASEAN. And if Clinton had been elected president, then that would have continued. The reality is we've seen not very much of that for the last 4 years. Yes, it's true that India and the United States' relationship has continued to progress and improve, but there's been barely a thought for Indonesia, barely a thought for ASEAN, the other ASEAN countries, and so that what we saw as the Indo-Pacific project stalled for 4 years. If Clinton had been president, we would have seen just south of here, everyone's aware of the arrangement we entered into with the United States for rotation of Marines through Darwin. We would have seen a much greater US naval presence at our naval base in Stirling. We would have seen, prospectively, Australian, Indian and US naval exercises, disaster relief exercises, naval exercises, and we've seen none of that. We also would have seen a far greater utilisation of by the US of some of what we call our bear bases in the northwest and northeast of Australia, so Curtin Air Base, Learmonth Air Base, and other air bases in the Northern Territory and Queensland. And that would have led to, for example, Indonesia, Australia and the US engaging in exercises. So all of that opportunity has been lost from a strategic and a defence and a military sense. But what has also been lost is strategic leadership from the United States. So whilst Trump has done a range of things with respect to China, generally it's been haphazard. It's sort of a policy that it's been formulated by tweets. There's no long-term coherent strategy to it. Now, Biden was fully engaged in those pivot decisions and in the movement from the United States from focusing entirely on Europe and the North Atlantic to a much greater, and China, to a much greater focus on the Indo-Pacific generally. And I'm confident that that will return. And when you look at the people who Biden has indicated he will nominate to senior positions, most of those officials are well known to Australians. They were, if you like, they were they were one out and one back in the Obama administration. So they were deputy secretaries or assistant secretaries or assistant national security advisors. They've all now taken a step up, so they go into leadership positions. And it is of advantage that after 4 years out of government, all of these experienced people come back in. So that's a very good, one good part of the American system is that after 4 or 8 years, and as Gordon said, generally 8 years, one team goes out, another team comes in, so you have this rotational effect. But if you've only been out for 4 years, you've got all of the experience of the 4 years, you've had time to think about the things you did well and badly and to reflect on that. You get a bit of a break and then you're back into the hurly-burly. So Biden is very well poised to advance that. And that's going to be to Australia and Western Australia and to Rockingham and HMAS Sterling advantage, both strategic and economic. One of the terrible things that Trump did was, you'll all recall that Australia, when Malcolm was Prime Minister, you had the phone call between Trump and Malcolm, which went very badly. We then had to work very hard to repair that. And Gordon and I were actually at the event in New York where the rapprochement became public. Now, to his credit, Malcolm Turnbull did a very good job of managing that. And after that point in time, Australia worked out that with a president like Trump, you should continue to do the day-to-day operational things with our US partner, with the alliance, but basically keep your head down. If the president's not seeing you, he won't cause you grief. And so essentially the approach was, let's just keep our heads down and keep the system turning over. Now with Biden and his administration, then there'll be much more forward-leaning and much more enthusiasm for Australia to say, well, we've got a whole range of ideas that we think you should contemplate for how you engage with the Indo-Pacific, how you engage with ASEAN, how you engage with Indonesia. So, for example, when I was a minister, which is not uncommon, indeed it's very common for foreign and defence ministers in the past, whenever I was having a meeting with US counterparts, at some stage they would say, okay, all that's well and good, now tell us what's happening in Indonesia. So the United States could rely upon Australia to have an informed view about Indonesia and a different view of Indonesia from what they might be picking up from their own mission, etc. So we had our problems and difficulties with Trump, but they were managed well by Malcolm and the government of the day, and then we kept our heads down. But for other US allies, they were treated very badly by Trump. So whether it was the United Kingdom, whether it was NATO and the Europeans, whether it was Japan, Korea, treated badly by Trump, particularly Korea and Japan. Biden will bring back, and a lot of Australian members of Parliament, ministers and officials know Biden well. So he was a member of the Senate Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee when I was Minister. I met him in that context. Plenty of people met him as Vice President when he came to Australia, so he's, inverted commas, a known commodity. But his natural style is to be consultative and to speak to people. So there's been a sigh of relief around the Indo-Pacific that Trump will be replaced with someone who will be a known commodity, will treat people with civility and respect, will have conversations, and will treat allies on an equal basis. So instead of surprising people, instead of South Korea, the Republic of Korea, finding out what was happening with North Korea after Trump did it, it'll be the usual and natural consultative process, and that'll be a good thing. On China, and apart from Biden's domestic difficulties, and they are considerable, so Biden inherits COVID-19 out of control, great economic disparity, a very difficult racial divide. He inherits a very difficult domestic portfolio. His single biggest first instance difficulty or challenge on the global and foreign and defence front will be China. Now, I'm not expecting that we'll see necessarily any great change of US attitude to China. And here it's important to go back to how the globe and how Australia and how the United States has viewed China for a long period of time. Australia's relationship in the modern era with China started in 1972 with Gough Whitlam's visit to Beijing when he was Leader of the Opposition, where he said that if I'm elected Prime Minister, I will recognise China with a one China policy. It wasn't fashionable, and Whitlam was widely criticised and condemned until 2 weeks later Nixon and Kissinger said the same thing. So essentially since 1972-73, the United States and Australia, that time it tells me that I'm about to make my final point. The attitude and the approach which Australia, the United States and the rest of the globe took was, we want China to enter into the world. We accept that China will be run by the Communist Party and the PLA. We accept it's not going to be a democracy, but we do expect and we do want China to emerge as what we used to call a responsible stakeholder. It will engage internationally, it will abide by the rules of the road, and that will do two things. It will enable countries like Australia and the United States to trade and invest in and with China, but it will also bring hundreds of millions of Chinese people out of poverty into a much greater and better standard of living. And all of that worked well, basically from 1972 until, in the Australian context, 2013, 2014, where under Xi Jinping, China materially changed. And it changed to being much more aggressive, much more assertive, much more problematic, and essentially its demeanour and its modus operandi now is that if China believes that what it's dealing with is a Chinese interest, it won't brook a conversation, let alone a negotiation about its policy approach. And so we see this on a whole range of issues. And that's led to, in the Australian context, our current trade difficulties with China, which aren't really trade difficulties per se, it's economic or trade punishment for political stances and policy stances that Australia has taken. In the United States, the last time that Gordon and I travelled to the United States together, which was obviously in 2019, we're at a meeting and the CEO of the strongest US lobby group for China, which is an organisation called the America-China Business Association. And for 30 or 40 years, that had been the biggest pro-China lobby for China. And the CEO leant over the table and said, 80% of my members won't have anything to do with China now. They break contracts, they don't abide by the rules of the road, they steal our intellectual property, we're not having a bar of them. And the question I asked was, is this anything to do with strategic, defence, military aspects, fear of China? They said, no, it's straightforward commercial reality. We don't want to have a bar of them. And so Trump responded to that. I think Biden will follow the general approach of being, inverted commas, hard on China. But with Biden, he'll at least talk to the Chinese, listen to the Chinese, be sophisticated and nuanced about his responses. And so in that context, there is some glimmer of hope that maybe if that relationship improves, it'll also improve for Australia. But at the moment, Australia, for a long period of time, we had our economic cake, which was trade with China. We had our military and strategic and security cake, which was called an alliance with the US, and both went along swimmingly. Now there's rubber hitting the road on that. And so we've had to try and manage an assertive and aggressive China and our trade relationships, and that's a difficulty for us now. There's no instant solution. The best hope for us is Biden, because currently the Chinese are not just making a point to Australia, they're using Australia as an example to the rest of the world. It's a bit like keeping your head down with Trump. If you stick your head up and do what Australia's done, then we will punish you. So from a domestic point of view, Biden inherits a whole range of difficulties. From an international perspective, he inherits a China challenge, but he also will return to what we saw and what Clinton saw and what Australian governments have been pursuing for nearly a couple of decades now, which is we're going to end up with what we call a multipolar world, where there'll be three great powers, China, US and India, and then lots of other significant influences, Indonesia, Japan, to a lesser extent Korea, and that's before we get to the Europeans and the EU. And that is a world which works for Australia, because we can then have our influence with a whole range of countries and partners. Because even though you'll often hear people saying Australia only ever does what the US tells us to do, That's not right. We give the Americans a lot of good advice about things that they can do which will work for them. And we've been very influential historically in working out when changes come. So we were the first dialogue partner for ASEAN. We were the first cab off the rank on the Indo-Pacific. We've been very good for a small population country at working out how is the world changing and how can we use that to our economic and security advantage. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, both Gordon and Stephen. I might give them a quick round of applause for that. I'll go to questions in a moment, but I just, if you don't mind me reflecting on a couple of things you've just said there, Stephen. The lost opportunity with the pivot not being realised, so the focus on the Indo-Pacific is, I think, a very real and valid point. It was we spent a lot of time, and Gordon knows, through the In the Zone conferences we worked on for a number of years to get people from the East Coast to think about where Perth sits in the economic story of Australia. All of Western Australia fits into it, but also how we fit in the region and the time zone we share and the relationships we have with very near neighbours that are also our principal trading partners and should be our future principal trading partners if we're to continue our economic prosperity. But as a young child growing up here in Rockingham, I have fond memories of in the late 80s when we would have a US Navy service people come to dinner at my parents' house. My dad was in the Royal Navy, so he loved talking to young American sailors, but that seemed to happen quite a bit, and then it petered off as different priorities of a US government, and I wonder if that comes back, that will be a good thing for this town, but for Fremantle as well, where we have more interaction with US sailors, and they do bring a lot of economic benefit to the community. There's no doubt about it. Also, just to reflect on what you said about the China relationship starting in the 70s, and there's a lot of talk about diversification you might hear in the media as people are worried about the trading relationship with China, and I think it bears remembering how long it took to build the economic relationship with China. That although Whitlam started the political and diplomatic relationship in the 70s, it was the really hard work of Bob Hawke and his team in the 80s building relationships with the Chinese government, followed then by Keating and then Howard building on that, which led eventually to many investment agreements and between China and Australian companies that opened up a lot of the Pilbara and the far north in gas, but then led to the free trade agreement and relationship we've kind of had that we now see at a pretty low ebb. And it's interesting how it intersects with the US alliance, especially with the Trump administration, where in the 2016 US election trade was weaponised and the Americans moved out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was not a good thing in my opinion, and now we have a situation where the US administration, it wasn't really it was a deal, as the words President Trump would use, but it's just a purchasing arrangement where the Chinese are obliged to buy a number of products from, and a value of products from the US, which of course means the products they might have bought from us in Australia, they no longer have to buy for us. So that's an ally that's not really doing good things for its ally Australia. So I think that bears remembering when we think of these topics, and hopefully, you know, that'll be repaired one day, and Joe Biden might move back to a more multilateral kind of way of thinking about our international trading links. So with my little commentary, I might open up the floor to questions. We have a microphone up the back, but let us just everyone wait for the microphone to get to you. So ma'am over here, or sir, sorry. One there, and then we'll go to there, and then I'll start again.
Thanks very much. I have a question for Gordon. Although the Electoral College votes have been counted, I understand that's not the end of it. That it goes to vote in both houses or just one?
So there's a formal process where it is presented on the 26th of December to the Vice President. It's just a presentation process. And then on the 6th of January it's voted in both houses. But again, these are pro forma things. I mean, the real issue is the entire thing is pro forma, to tell you the truth, right? There has never been a case in American history of where the Electoral College has been knocked back, not voted on by the Congress. If something were to happen, it would have happened today. There was some anxiety about having, about the prospect of faithless electors, people who, despite the vote of their state, would vote for Trump otherwise.
But taking into consideration the attitude of the Republics and the case that went to the High Court and all the majority of the Republicans in the Congress supported it, but I understand that there have been 3 occasions in the 19th century where the Electoral College has been overturned. Is that correct? Or?
No, in the 19th century, yes. In the early 1800s, there's a few things, but again, this was right around the Civil War, a different era. Hasn't happened in the last 120 years.
So you would say it's a formality then?
Very much a formality.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, I don't want to understate how damaging the last month and a half has been. This is really unprecedented, right? Normally, when a president who has been defeated or a leader who has been defeated refuses to acknowledge that, this is something that we would condemn if it took place in any other country around the world. The fact that it's being perpetrated by the United States is not a good thing. To put things in context, there have now been 53 different lawsuits lodged by the president's campaign. Of those, 52 of those have been knocked back with some derision by the court, mostly by Republican judges. Only one has been successful, and that was the very first one. There was a very minor issue in a single county in Pennsylvania about whether or not ballots could be received 6 days after the election, coming by mail, or 9 days after, and that was it. It had no impact on it whatsoever. So it's a remarkable thing. The fact that this last week the Supreme Court refused to hear the case launched by 17 different Republican states led by the Attorney General of Texas, well, again, it was a shocking development. It really was. The fact that, as you rightly point out, 126 members, fully 60% of the members of the House of Representatives signed on to that, is a shocking development, which is not good. So this is what I was somewhat callously or cavalierly referring to as taking your car and scraping it along, the guardrail. It didn't change the results, but it's not good. It's a very damaging thing, and it damages American credibility. But I remain fundamentally optimistic about where we're going. If you look at again, and Professor Smith referenced this, if you look at the quality and the caliber and the diversity of those who have been nominated thus far for senior posts in the Biden administration, we in Australia, I think, have gotten pretty smug for the last 4 years, right? Because you can look at the U.S. and say, look how dysfunctional that place, look at how horrid these people are. But the reality is, I think you're going to see in the next 4 years a very, very proactive, internationalist, progressive United States. And that's going to be a different era. A part of that really is just demographics, right? I view the last 4 years as kind of the last gasp. If you're on a certain side of the political spectrum, you call the last gasp of the patriarchy, right? Or the last gasp of those people who wanted to make America great again. In other words, they wanted to make it dominated by white, male, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? Where they, historically did not have to compete with women in the workforce, did not have to compete with minorities in the workforce, did not have to compete with other countries in international trade. And so clearly they have lost a lot of power, lost a lot of influence, lost a lot of say, and they are not happy about it, right? And overwhelming, they're voting for one political party. But that isn't representing America today, right? 8 million, nearly 8 million more votes voted for a different vision of the country, right? And so again, this to me is similar to the waning days of the Iraq War, what they called the dead enders, right? Those people who had everything to lose from the change of the regime, had nothing to gain from going along, and they're just holding on. But in the end, demography matters, right? People matter, and that shift has taken place. And so I'm much more optimistic about the future, although there will be rough days ahead.
Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. Excellent question. And to this gentleman up here on the right.
Thank you. Just a question for Gordon. Do you think that President Trump, when he steps out of office, will try and consolidate that sort of base and come back in the next 4 years?
Oh, nobody knows. There's a lot of concern and speculation about what he might do post-presidency. Does he start his own TV station? Does he try to kind of continue this kind of this movement, this cult of personality almost that he's built up among his most fervent supporters? Again, here I often a little bit of perspective, right? A vast majority probably of my own relatives ultimately voted for Donald Trump. They don't like necessarily Donald Trump. If you look at the 74 million Americans who voted for it, some observers in Australian media will say, oh my goodness, America is broken. How can it possibly go forward? Look at 74 million voters voted for this guy. Now, my view is about 20% of Trump supporters are hardcore, red hat, MAGA-wearing, rally-going Trumpists for whom the cruelty of the message is the point. They're unhappy, and they like it, and there is a strong racist, misogynistic trend among them. But that's not necessarily true of the majority of those voters. A lot of those are people who are deeply, fervently religious. They voted on one issue, and one issue alone is abortion, and only on abortion. And then there's another chunk of them who have just been victims of the current media environment in the United States who just candidly are misinformed on these issues. So I'm pretty optimistic that what we do not have is an environment where 75 million Americans are going to remain excited and energized in support of Donald Trump. There will be that there. It has to be dealt with. It's serious, but it's not what it appears to be right now. There are some real issues about the president going forward, and there's some suggestion that one of the reasons he's breaking every established norm in terms of the transfer of power is because he's afraid of the future, of lawsuits, of bankruptcy, of a whole range of other issues that is coming down the pike. But the short answer is nobody knows, just as nobody knew that the last month and a half after the election would be so unprecedented. So I anticipate a chaotic, bumpy ride, but in the long run, hammered out. Yeah.
Can I just add? I think one of the real sort of problems that Biden has is, referred to it in passing, is sort of economic disparity. And I think the perception that we have here is that anyone who's out there supporting Trump is a deplorable or a nutter or whatever. Gordon made this point to me some time ago, which is Trump won the election in 2016 because he was able to put that group of people on top of the Republican Party vote. So I think you've got two things. There is quite a strong political attachment in the US. Once a Republican, always a Republican, once a Democrat, always a Democrat. So it takes a lot to get people to shift. But secondly, there are a group of people, large group of people who vote for Trump in 1620, not because they have views which aren't mainstream views, but essentially because they regard themselves as being economically disenfranchised. And you can see when you look at the map, the blue down the west coast, down the north-east coast, and in the middle you've got red. And in that red, you can go to a population centre, so you can go to the capital city of the state, and Biden will do well. It'll be 50-50 or 40-60 or even 60-40. But you get a very short distance outside of the population centre, and it's 80-20 Trump, because in those areas, people believe that their chance of the American dream has gone. So the economy's changed, what we would call rural and regional Australia or rural and regional America. There's no economy, there's no jobs, there's no opportunity, there's no this or that. And so that was a fault in the eyes of those people, fault of both the Democrats and the Republicans. So if someone new came along who's going to shake the show up, why wouldn't I go for him? Because nothing else is working for me. So the big economic challenge, domestic economic challenge for Biden is, can he somehow find an economic pathway for those people to say, actually, I can put my faith back into the American dream. If I say to my children, work hard at school, get an education, get a job, you'll be able to go forward. You'll be able to carve out a life for yourself. If you can reinstill that faith in the non-population centres, then the basis on which a candidate like Trump or a Trump family member can prosper is substantially diminished. You then go back to mainstream Democrat, mainstream Republican. So Trump's genius, in a sense, was he used all of that to take over a political party. In the Australian context, No one's tried to take over Labor or Liberal. That sentiment has been evidenced by independents or individual candidates who run in the Senate. So whether it's Hanson or what's his name?
Catter.
Catter or Palmer, whoever it is. And so they get strong support for a period of time, and then when the issue passes, someone else comes along. So in a sense, there's a danger in Australia of a major political party being taken over by someone like Trump, but we've managed to sustain that. So if you can solve that economic problem, you take a lot of the wind out of the sail of Trump or a family member or someone equivalent.
Agreed.
And I could say that discontent of that population too that did get in behind Trump is magnified all the more by the lack of a public health system or adequate welfare system when times are tough.
We spend, and Kim Beazley always makes this point, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars in Australia trying to make sure there's a safety net. Whereas in the US, basically, if you don't have a job, you don't have health insurance, you're then basically in the hands of state governments who have different systems of trying to help people, but never with the economic horsepower that the United States itself does, or in the Australian context that the Commonwealth does.
Some more questions? Any gentleman up the back there?
Stephen, I was wondering if you could comment on the Hugh White thesis, which, if I can perhaps paraphrase it, China's a rising power economically. It is by different, either it already has or in the next 7 or 8 years is likely to exceed the economic power of the United States. It's naturally going to seek to project its power and influence, at least regionally. That our best outcome, Australia's best outcome, is that in a sense America will back off a bit to allow that to happen, but he is quite critical of the Australian defence and foreign affairs establishment, which he says views a shooting war, which is the other potential outcome, with some equanimity, and even want to encourage a stronger a sort of approach by the United States. Now, perhaps you could comment, and if do you see how the election of a Biden administration might affect those assessments?
Well, a lot in that, and let me make this point. Hugh's original and first thesis was that China was going to become all powerful, and as a consequence of that, we should throw in the US alliance and essentially throw a lot in with China. But he's walked back from that since his first thesis. Look, if current projections are met, China will end up being the largest economy in the world and get there quite quickly. I say current projections because we've got the highways and byways of history are littered with countries who don't meet their potential or who fail, and projections which aren't met for a whole range of reasons. And there's a separate strand of thought that whilst China is perceived to look very strong at the moment, there are a whole range of internal weaknesses, in part driven by Xi Jinping's authoritarian approach, which may well see China falter and stumble. And no country is a monolith, and so it makes no sense for Australia to not continue to talk to China or to try and talk to China, because you can always do some good by trying to have the conversation. So on current projections, China will end up being the most significant economic, and as a consequence of that, potentially significant military power. But currently, as a result of the way that China has conducted itself, China's only potential allies are itself, North Korea, possibly Iran. That's about it. Whereas in the US and rest of the world context, you've got a range of like-minded countries, all of whom have comparable or similar values, who essentially say, well, China may well end up being the single largest power, but that doesn't mean we should accept nor kowtow to the current expression of Chinese values and virtues. And that's when you say, okay, it makes sense from an Australian perspective, but also from a regional and global perspective, US, Japan, Australia, Indonesia, India, Europe, etc. That's a significant group of countries potentially in strategic competition with China. I currently describe the state of the sort of, US-China relationship as Cold War with economic characteristics. Why do I say that? The last Cold War, there was no economic relationship between the US and the Soviet Union at all. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, it essentially had no adverse economic impact on anyone except the Soviet Union and then Russia. China is single largest trading partner to over 200 countries and has an economy which is inextricably interwoven with US economy, despite the step back by US in recent times. So there are lots of incentives to try and make the US-China, China-rest of world relationship better. Now, it may well get worse before it gets better, but there's lots of incentives to try and get China to modify, get China to change course, but also to say to China, there's a whole range of countries here who you may seek to try and punish, but you can't punish everyone from the US to India. In the end, no one wants there to be an unbridled conflict between China and the US or China and anyone. And I don't regard China as being a naturally expansionist power. But like any great power, whether it's the UK historically, the US itself, or other powers over history, they do like to, as Paul Keating used to say, create space for themselves. In other words, they like to have clear sea lanes of communication. They like to have a capacity to protect their trade routes. And that's what China said it was doing with respect to the South China Sea, but then proceeded to militarise the South China Sea. And so that's the concern. So I think the answer is essentially not Hugh's thesis, either thesis number one or the amended thesis. It's essentially Australia and the rest of the world saying, we're living in a multipolar world. That means that no one nation can do everything by itself or require other nations to do everything that it wants it to do. And there are a whole range of international challenges which impact upon China, which can only be solved by the world working together. And climate change is the first and best example. And I think that means in a multipolar world, US, Japan, Korea, European Union, Australia, India, Indonesia, sitting down with China gives you a way forward. Now, whether China responds to that in the first instance or at all, time will tell. But I think that's the sort of approach which Biden is more likely to bring than an openly confrontationist approach.
Let me just add to this very briefly in that I've, over the course of 2 decades now, had in international conferences this running debate with Hugh White on this very topic. And one of my real beefs with Donald Trump is that he has given air to Hugh White, right? I mean, pre-Trump election, that thesis had largely been discounted whatsoever, right? And one of my biggest differences, and this is where words matter, is central to Hugh's presumption, is that the Americans wanted primacy for primacy's sake. And in my 25 years in Washington, D.C., I never heard a single defense planner, government official ever use the term primacy, American primacy. If you took that term and just changed it to leadership, right, it's very fundamentally different, right? Americans like to perceive themselves as the good guys, not the bad guys, right? And Donald Trump came in, and Donald Trump was all about primacy for primacy's sake, right? Because he wanted to be the top dog, and for the purpose of being the top dog, right? That is not Joe Biden. That is not the norm in American statecraft, in American foreign policy, and American security policy. So I think you're going to see a very quick course correction on that front, because leadership means that you want to do it for the global good, right? For the benefit of the system, the rules-based order that we rely upon. The final comment I'll make on this, and this is quite brief, is that when I arrived in WA 7 years ago, I brought with me some fundamental biases that came after 25 years in Washington working with China, where, I had 30-odd trips to 40 different provinces, cities throughout China, deep friendships in China, don't consider myself for a second to be a China basher, and yet I arrived on St. George's Terrace, where they were still imagining up 1 billion metric tons of steel consumption every year and building all their planning around that, with a fundamentally skeptical view of China. So my mantra was, I am more concerned about Chinese weakness than I am Chinese strength. Right? And I always quip in recent days, whenever I do media on this, the one person I know who agrees with me is Xi Jinping. Right? A lot of his actions are fundamentally driven out of insecurity, concern about China. So to tie the two topics together, I would say, despite the dysfunction we've seen in the United States for the last 4 years, I would take all the challenges and dysfunction of a COVID-ridden, struggling nation with Donald Trump in the United States before I took the challenges facing Xi Jinping today. They've got an awful lot in terms of demography, the legitimacy of the governments, the minority issues, and their relationships to the world, which is a really tough row to hoe.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you finished on there, Gordon. A couple more questions. Does any women want to ask a question? Because I notice... So I'm going to go up the back, if I could.
I think words do... Oh, sorry. Excuse me. I think words do matter. And I'm talking about ordinary Australians, when I buy a Chinese product, I see beautifully packed, stamped, made in China. I see pride in that product. When I say to other Australians, I've just bought a Chinese product, the most likely comment I'll get is, it's cheap, substandard technology. How do we deal with this problem? This is the words we Australians use about China. How do we come to be a reasonable human being that can see China is changing? It is not the China of 1900. It hasn't yet reached the China of 2,000 years ago, but it is going to be significant in the future. We have to change our attitude, not our politics.
So I think this may be a question for the Shadow Trade Minister, but I couldn't agree more. I think it's really important in our public discourse to make sure that we don't distinguish the actions of a particular leader or a political party with a people, right? We don't have a beef with the Chinese people, or their very good efforts, or their very natural aspirations for a better life, right? But we may have a trouble with a government, and with particular demands of that government, which are not necessarily calibrated to the interests of that people, but to the interests of that individual or that government.
I would just add, anyone that's got an iPhone knows what remarkable machines they are, and they're all made in China, and I would agree. Like they construct amazing things, but it's the global supply chain that makes everything work. The components come from all around the world, and the design is in California, but the product itself that we end up buying comes out of China. I would agree. I'm going to move on. There was another lady here, and they're going to come back over here, and then down to you, sir. Thank you.
I think probably Gordon would be the person to ask. With these two elections crucial in Georgia, if the Democrats don't win, what can Biden do to carry out his agenda anyway?
So that's something I did not mention. The way the U.S. system works is the president, the executive branch, has relatively limited powers by himself without the concurrence or the support of the legislative branch, so the House of Representatives and the Senate. And at present, right now, it is a 52-48 advantage for the Republicans. There are two by-elections, and again, every U.S. state does things a little bit differently. In the state of Georgia, if you don't get 50% of the vote in the election, then you have to go to a special runoff. And that's taking place on the 5th of January, so just a few weeks from now, right? And in that case, there are two Democratic challengers and two Republican incumbents. If it happens that the Republicans win, which is probably still odds-on most likely, that means that the Republicans will maintain control over the Senate and the ability to block or make a Biden agenda quite difficult. Now, again, we don't know exactly what will happen. I don't think anybody has any confidence as to who actually will turn out in terms of the election itself. But this is also an important thing to understand if you want to understand why Republicans have been so seemingly crazy over the last 2 months. And the reason is they're caught in a catch-22. They cannot win those 2 Senate seats without Donald Trump's help. Right? They would lose them. Without his MAGA crazies coming along, they won't win. And so they have to keep him on board in time for the election, even though they know that in the long term that's doing damage to democracy and their own image. But that's their last chance to hold on to power. You know, I'm actually not as dismally alarmed that even if the Republicans hold on to the Senate, that there won't be an opportunity for Biden to work around it, because you've got senators like Mitt Romney from Utah, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Susan Collins from Maine. So it would be very difficult for the Republicans to resist with a very narrow majority. And I'm quite confident someone like Joe Biden, with his 50 years in Washington, D.C., would be capable of kind of working through that system. But clearly, that's a very important thing I did not mention. And it's something for, if you're missing out your daily feed of U.S. politics, it's not over yet. That election is coming up on the 5th of January.
I think just the gentleman asked a question here earlier about, we've had the college vote today, but isn't there another step? I think part of the mainstream Republicans' reticence about saying what they know as reality and conceding and getting on with it is Georgia. So once Georgia's out the way in early January, you've then got the inauguration day, 21st. So I think a lot is invested by the Republicans not wanting to criticise Trump as a result of Georgia. Once that's gone, then I think there'll be a whole range of mainstream Republicans who will accept reality. And I'm not, on the balance of probabilities, I think Gordon's right that the Republicans they'll win the 2 Senate spots in Georgia, which means the Republicans will have a Senate majority. But I'm, like Gordon, very confident that that's precisely the environment in which Biden will flourish. He needs to unite the country, not divide it. And if he's going to unite the country, having to do a negotiation process with mainstream or moderate Republicans actually helps and assists that. Mm-hmm. And so I think he'll be able to stare them down with a range of proposals. So often, politically, be careful what you wish for. If you get the numbers in the Legislative Council or the Senate, you then tend to do a whole range of things which the community work out they don't necessarily want. So it'll be a break on Biden, but I think there's no one better place than Biden to try and turn that to his advantage.
I'll ask the question generally to the panel. I'm happy whoever nominates an answer. The focus, obviously, in the election this year was on Biden and the incumbent President Trump. There were, I understand, at least 2 other candidates on the ballot. Joe Jorgensen, I believe, was on the ballot in some of the states, and perhaps one other individual. Moving forward beyond, obviously, an election we've just had, what's your view about the emergence of other prospective individuals putting themselves forward beyond, the traditional Republican and Democrat nominee? You talked about Trump going away and, starting his own television channel. Someone like Oprah Winfrey already has a television channel. The person we hear most about as another prospective candidate is someone like Kanye West. Moving forward, what do you see the prospect of the US elections sort of evolving into a richer contest than just the Democrats and Republicans?
Well, I'll give you the quick answer, and then Gordon can give you a scientific answer. Not much chance. Yep. Gordon?
If you'd asked me that question before this election, I would have just said absolutely no chance whatsoever. The only viable third-party candidates that we've had in my lifetime was Ross Perot in 1992, and he cost George H.W. Bush the re-election, but never was in serious danger of actually winning the election. The U.S. system, since the creation of the Republican Party in 1860, I think, has had a pretty robust 2-party system, and no one's been able to kind of break beyond that. The hesitancy I have about dismissing that definitively is that there is a growing concern that the Republican Party itself has lost its way, that as it's become the party of Trump, there are calls for it to be reborn or recreated, in a form of a conservative party. I think that's unlikely. I think there will be a few people that have managed to maintain a shred of credibility. They'll come back to try to rebuild it. But who knows? If Trump maintains his grip on the party, then the Republican Party will continue its demise. And it's already in serious danger of being a permanent minority party, unable to win national races. And it may not seem like that now, but again, this is the last gasp for them holding on to. And for them to be relevant in the future is going to require a fundamentally different strategy, which to date they've not been capable of. And then if that were indeed the case, then the notion that all parties are permanent is not necessarily clear, right? The Democrats themselves have such a broad church right now, you can see some fissures. So I'm less inclined to dismiss it given how wrong I've been consistently for the last 4 years. So.
I think seriously, I think that gentleman.
Thanks. The question's to Stephen. While this election is going on, we've seen the COVID, playing its role, and it has changed. I think it's changing the economic and political profiles and the way people think in macro level. And so if we can somehow isolate the effects of COVID in the American political system, the challenges it presents, where Obama's sort of political agenda for this part of the world, when it starts progressing again, do you think that the way the COVID has changed the thinking of this part of the world will have some kind of like a bearing on the way that agenda can progress?
Well, for a couple of things. Firstly, managing COVID or trying to bring COVID under control will be Biden's first and main challenge, and that will consume him initially. Vaccine obviously help. Trying to persuade the governors and the American people to take sensible precautions will help. But that'll certainly be uppermost on his mind. In terms of what have we learned from COVID that helps us in terms of the comedy of nations and nations dealing with each other? Well, one thing that Australia's certainly learned is it makes sense to have security and diversity of supply chains, because you never quite know what you might need to be able to produce in a hurry. And so a lot of the internal domestic focus now is, well, what are the things that we need to be able to have diversity of supply on? What are the things where we need to be able to have a domestic capability if we need to do that, either on an ongoing basis or in extremis, in a crisis? And so all countries are now saying, well, we get our coal from Australia, but we also get it from other countries as well, so we need to make sure that we've got continuity and diversity of supply. We discovered that all of our public protection equipment for health workers and the like was all produced in China, and when China wanted it all for itself, we had to scramble and work out how to do it here. So there's a whole sort of litany now of what are the things that we need to have more than one international supply chain for or sources of. What do we need to do ourselves? So India, for example, now has this slogan, a resilient India, a resilient and self-reliant India. When I speak to Indian friends, I say, I want you to be resilient and I want you to be self-reliant, but I want you to be self-reliant with Australia's assistance. And so in a whole range of areas, particularly when we're trying to grow trade with India, with Indonesia, areas where we can provide them with diversity and security of supply will actually help them, because everyone's seen the sanctity of the supply chain, which is a point Madeleine made earlier. In terms of the relationship between countries, leaders have now found they don't actually have to get on a plane and fly and visit someone to actually have a conversation with them. And Gordon and I have found this in the daily work of the Perth USAsia Centre. We previously would work hard to get senior people from India, Indonesia and the United States here once or twice a year. Now we get them on Zoom conferences once a month. So the conversations, the personable and personal conversations will be much more regular. And in my era, you'd have formal conversations with foreign and defence ministers, but the ones that you were friendly with and the ones that you could do things with, you would text or you would email directly. Now there's much more capacity to have extensive conversations with people, even though you don't have to waste a day getting on a plane, etc. So it's going to have an impact. The notion of essential travel has changed completely, and the capacity for leaders to engage in very quick and speedy one-on-one or group conversations is, much enhanced by the platforms that we now have. So it's changed the world, but the first thing we have to do is get it under control, and that'll be Biden's biggest challenge in first instance.
The food on Zoom is not nearly as good, though.
Now, I have taken us a few minutes, about 5 minutes over. If you will indulge me, 2 quick questions, 2 quick answers. So, Pauline, and then you, sir. Did you have a question for next?
Thank you, Madeleine. Getting back to the nitty-gritty, given the number of people that Trump has been sacking and replacing with not quite know what, but certainly his followers, how much of that is going to affect Biden? Can he just get rid of the people that Trump's been doing this in the interim period, or is he stuck with them?
Thank you. So the U.S. system is very different than Australia. The bureaucracy, there's 3.2 million people that work in the federal bureaucracy, not including the military. And to run an organization that large, any incoming president has about 4,000 political appointees that come in, who are the ones who set the agendas. Of those 4,000 political appointees, about 500, slightly under 500, are senior Senate confirmed. The Trump administration started out, to be very blunt, with the vast majority of traditional Republicans signing Never Trump letters, so they were never available. He never got more than 70% of his positions filled at that senior level because the people wouldn't join him. So he was crippled from the very beginning, not with an A team or a B team, but starting with a D team and then going down from there. And it all ran to the White House anyway. They will all be gone. All those. So they will all be replaced by political appointees. The Biden campaign a month ago put out a list of 4,000 potential political appointees. They know exactly who's going in what and how to begin that process. And the good news, and Stephen referred to this before you disparage about how broken America is, these people didn't go anywhere. They've just been sitting there waiting for their turn again. The intellectual capital, the experience, the relationships, they're all there, and you're going to see them swarm in a remarkable way, because that's the way the U.S. system works.
I have about 15 questions to ask, but I don't think I'll be allowed that many. I think it'll be Professor Smith. No, I'm going to revert to not the one about the Soviet Union. My childhood echoed with comments about Pig Iron Bob, and Sir Robert Menzies sold things to Japan and it came back as weapons. I think many Australians fear that all the natural resources that are going to China might come back in an unpleasant way. Any comment?
Well, Madeleine said short questions and short answers, so there's a PhD in the response, but let me try and give you the abridged version. Australia's post-World War II prosperity has been off the back of US investment into minerals and petroleum resources, and Australia creating export industries in minerals and petroleum resources to North Asia. Japan first, Korea second, and China third. So coal, iron ore, and then LNG, although technically LNG went to China before it went to Korea. And that's been the mainstay of Australian prosperity pretty much since the 1980s. We started doing that in 1957 with a manufacturing trade agreement with Japan, which saw coal and iron ore go there. 12 years after the end of a bitter war in the Pacific, so that was quite remarkable. But it took us from 1957 really to the 80s to establish that prosperity pathway. often worth remembering, China only became our largest trading partner in 2009, so less than a dozen years. Our prosperity before that was essentially off the back of Japan, who was our largest trading partner for 20 years until 2008. Our problem now with those commodities, coal, not here but from the eastern seaboard, coal, iron ore, so coal is thermal, heating, power, metallurgical, making steel, iron ore and LNG, is that leave China to one side, they're all on a 30-year downhill trend. And they're on a downhill trend because they're all fossil fuels. Thermal coal will go first. No one's investing in thermal coal. Metallurgical coal and iron ore will go when someone can make steel without utilising either or both of them. And LNG is a transitional fuel but will be replaced ultimately by hydrogen or renewables. So our prosperity time span is about 30 years, which is the same period of time that we grew those industries in the first place. So the single biggest challenge for Australia is not the worry about weapons coming back from China. Our single biggest challenge is what do we do now and over the next 30 years to replace those rivers of prosperity that we've seen in place, planning since 1957, in reality since the early to mid-1980s. Unfortunately, neither Indonesia, India nor Vietnam want our iron ore, coal or LNG. So what are the things that we can do and do well which will feed into those large population markets, 1.4 India, 300 million Indonesia soon and 100 million Vietnam? That's the big challenge, and I've got to tell you, it's a bigger challenge than getting iron ore or coal or LNG to Japan, Korea or China, because there's no single bullet solution. So to me, in all of the things we do, it's sort of what's our project diversification to make sure that in 30 years' time, people sitting here will have the same Western Australian and Australian prosperity that we've had for the last 30 or 40 years. That's our biggest challenge. I said earlier, China will walk through the valley of death over hot coals to secure Taiwan and Hong Kong and Tibet, and that'll bring with it its own complications, but it's not, in my view, a regionally expansive power. I could be wrong on that, and that's why people take precautions. But putting that to one side, our single biggest challenge is what are we going to do now, planning for the next 30 years, to ensure our ongoing prosperity? Because if we don't do that planning now, then there'll be nothing to replace that in 30 years' time, and there's only one outcome of that, is that all of our living standards and lifestyle goes down. On that optimistic note,
maybe we should wrap up. And it should be remembered the iron ore embargo that was lifted was driven by Sir David Brand, who was the Premier of the time, who Western Australia, for which this seat is named, and took a lot of effort to lift that so that we could build those industries, in which Sir Charles Court, of course, helped build, and it was that vision then that led to the prosperity now. Exactly what Stephen is saying is right, that now we have to repeat that activity and do it with dedication and commitment, and that is what Australian leaders should be doing. I don't think we're doing it enough, and that's what we keep talking to the government about and trying to get them to do. With that, I am going to hand over in a moment to Acting Vice-Chancellor David Morrison from Murdoch University. Thank my dear friends Stephen Smith and Gordon Flake for coming here tonight, but hand over to David for the vote of thanks.
Thanks very much, Madeleine, and congratulations to you for these events. This is the third one that we've had here, and each event has had an ever-increasing number of people. And I know that we have plans for next year to continue these. Don't quite know who the speakers are going to be yet, but they've got a lot to live up to, I have to say. I think the first talk was Jeremy Nicholson, who scared the life out of us about COVID. And it's a disease you really don't want to get. And then we had Elaine Holmes, who talked about, I think, the dangers of getting old and what you should eat as you get older, and your gut health. But it's been an absolute privilege this evening to hear from Stephen and Gordon. And obviously the election in the last 6 weeks or so has been absolutely fascinating. I spent some time living in the US as well, and what is going on with those people? And I loved the place. And just when you think it can't get any worse, it actually does. But I have got refamiliarised myself with CNN. CNN's been a great winner out of this, so I spend probably a couple of hours every night listening to that. I just like Fox News, but there we are. This has been a really fascinating evening, and the engagement of the audience has been absolutely terrific as well. It's fantastic to see the community here engaging with this. We'd love to get young people, obviously, have an interest in politics, but it's obviously, and hopefully they're watching via the new technologies that they have available to them. So hi to all you folks at home. And I think one of the things that's come out of all of this stuff, the COVID stuff especially, and the American election, is the interest that people have had in actually what experts have got to say. They've become fascinated with experts and fascinated what the scientists and the politicians have got to say. And I think one of the two things that, for me, in the last little while that's happened is that people have lost, two things are important: trust and truth. And sometimes they don't always go together. And I remember and I'll end now, because I know everybody wants to get away. We ran a competition a few years ago among school children in this region. We had the naked scientist who'd come and done lectures here. And we wanted to give a prize to some of the school kids for their engagement. And we asked them beforehand, give us a question that you would like to ask the naked scientist, and we'll give a prize of a book or something to the person who asked the best question. We had some really great questions, and the people asked questions like, where do flies go at night? And I can't remember who the politician was who was actually was at this at the officiating event that we held to give the prize winner. We decided the prize winner before we knew who the politician was and what the winner was going to be. And the punchline was the student that won the prize was, with the best question, how can you tell when politicians lie? And I think, as I said, I think Trump has given us some great lessons, some great pointers in that. Opens his mouth. But social media has also got a lot to answer for as well. So that's another great topic of debate about the wheres and why-fors and the goods and evils of social media and the echo chambers that it creates. Oh well, it leaves me, though, to thank you again, Madeleine, but to thank Stephen and Gordon for an absolutely fascinating and riveting evening that I certainly enjoyed, and just tell by the questions that we got from everybody that you all enjoyed it too. So again, just join me perhaps in thanking our speakers and Madeleine first.
So that concludes the event, everyone. I'd like to say thanks so much for coming. The Brand Community Lecture Series will restart up again next year. Sign up to the Perth USAsia Centre if you want to get emails from them on the things they do. They have amazing talks that are open to the public and they stream. So please get involved, and I hope you all have a lovely Christmas, a wonderful summer and a really restful break after a really difficult year. So thanks very much, everyone.